everyone hear me okay? Thank you, Ray. That was such a generous introduction. It's really lovely to be here with everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. And I'm grateful for this invitation to get to share some of my research on Afro-Latinx art as part of the Gale Memorial Speaker Series. I'd really like to thank Ray and Nandasangad for this kind invitation and all of the staff who also made this visit possible, especially to Annette Peterson, who helped me arrange a lot of logistics. Many years ago, as Ray mentioned, I applied for the Ph.D. program here in art history at UNM to work with David Craven and Holly Barnett Sanchez. I was offered admission to the program, and I sometimes think about how different my life would have been if I had come to Albuquerque. Their pioneering work has continued with Professor Kenzie Cornejo and Professor Hernandez Duran, both of whom I greatly admire. Your students are very lucky to have such distinguished professors in the field, and UNM remains one of the top programs in which to pursue Latin American and Latinx art history. 2023 has been a very good year for me with the publication of my monograph, Reclaiming the Americas, Latinx Art and the Politics of Territory. I actually spoke with my press contact this morning, and she told me that in just 6 months we have sold just shy of 500 copies of the book, which is pretty incredible to me. Because we worked on these projects for a very long time and very much in isolation. So we don't imagine that many people will actually get to read it and have access to it. So I'm super grateful for that support. In my talk today, I'll begin with an overview of the book, and then I'll focus on one particular chapter, which addresses the work of the print collective Dominican York, Proyecto en Africa, and their desire to forge connections to the Black Atlantic. I will then talk a little bit about an exhibition that developed from this research, All My Ancestors, the Spiritual and Afro-Latinx Art, which I curated for the Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia. What I hope to show you through this visual evidence is the deep desire many Dominican American artists have to forge a Black consciousness in diaspora. It's a submerged perspective in regards to the racial geographies they experience back on their home island and here in the U.S. So let's get started. Reclaiming the Americas examines the history of the Latinx graphic arts movement, and I use the word movement intentionally to allude to the collaborative and collective efforts to deploy reproductive technologies that allow these artists to create a print culture based on self-expression and self-definition. Throughout the last 5 decades, printmaking has become one of the most popular mediums for Latinx artists, and this led to the creation of institutional archives, workshops, collectives, and networks, and yet this extensive presence was largely understudied in the history of graphic arts and unacknowledged in the history of American art. The book begins with the premise that printmaking as a medium was in fact complicit in distributing the spatial logics of colonization. Some of the earliest representations of the Americas were produced as woodcuts and engravings that defined land as terra incognita, nullius, and nova, lands inhabited by savage others who practiced cannibalism. I became interested in how these artists took it back and restored the art form and lands it once illustrated to the indigenous, migrant, mestizo, and Afro-descendant peoples of the Americas. Each of my case studies follows a resident artist or a print collective and provides a close reading of their work. The methodology was important to urge my readers to focus on the formal and experimental qualities of the work, which have often been neglected in Latinx art historiography due to the relevance of social history. However, I do not isolate these objects from their social contexts. In fact, I discuss at length the cultural milieu of the workshop settings, their relationship to American and Latin American art histories, and the diasporic iconography that places them in a transnational context. In the book, I identify 4 different approaches in their representations of territory, which are native, embodied, mestiza, and aqueous territorialities that delink from Western conceptions of land and offer alternative ways of relating to territory. Most of the artists in my book are making work that relates to land and the complex identities that they have developed as borderland subjects in an increasingly anti-immigrant nation. But what I found most fascinating about the Dominican York Gloria Geográfica's inaugural portfolio, Manifestaciones, is that these claims did not hinge on land. Instead, they looked at water. These artists recoded geographic representations from the viewpoint of island dwellers who experience water boundaries. Bodies of water are spaces loaded with Western cartography's colonial gaze, mediating the painful entry and exit of islanders, witness to the winds of repeated U.S. intervention, and yet offering the hope of a better horizon. These oceans, seas, rivers, channels do not necessarily operate under the same logic of expropriation and settlement, but they are placed and bordered just the same. In theorizing their work as aqueous territorialities, I show their insistence in forging connections to the Black Atlantic as a way to combat the anti-blackness of the Pugiato in the Dominican Republic and the racial exclusions they experience in the U.S. As these artists were coming together to develop their collaborative portfolios, intellectuals like Jorge Garcia Pena were theorizing how the Dominican nation-state projected exclusionary borders around the Mingaida in the form of dictions that denied and obscured the presence of racialized Dominicans. Of particular importance to this study, Garcia Pena used those forced to migrate and inhabit the liminal identity of Dominican York as subjects of border embodiment. She triangulates those borders between the U.S., DR, and Haiti in order to stress how these exclusions, often phrased in everyday dictions such as Llano, Viejo, the sexualized Dominicana, and Dominicana ausente, are products of colonial history. Whereas much of borderlands and transnational literature emphasizes geographic points of in-betweenness, Garcia Pena proposed the racialized Dominican body as both the carrier of the burdens of coloniality and the site of agency that can contradict official discourses of the state and create new forms of belonging. So I want us to pay particular attention to how these artists oppose the marginalization and alterity of racialized Dominican bodies and use their prints to instill a new sense of belonging. In 2000, the Santo Domingo-born New York artist Sherazade Garcia represented the Dominican Republic at the Havana Biennial with Paraíso, an installation of painted crib mattresses bathed in the light of a palm tree-filled sky. Each mattress featured a barely discernible dark-skinned angel embellished with elaborate and ornamental brushwork. The reflective quality of the plastic-encased mattresses, in conjunction with the skyward-oriented video, made the angels appear to emerge out of water. The racialized bodies of the artist's brown-skinned icons commented on the precarious condition of exile and the frailty of paradise. Born to a politically active family of African, French, and Native American heritage, Garcia immigrated to the U.S. in 1986 to pursue a BFA at the Parsons School of Design. She had recently graduated from the prestigious Altos de Chabón School of Design in La Romana, on the southeast coast of the DR. Through a partnership with Parsons, Altos de Chabón sent a small number of promising students to complete their studies in the U.S., and Garcia's portfolio earned her a full scholarship. When she arrived in New York in the mid-1980s, there were few Dominican artists, but within a decade, after several waves of Chaboneros settled in the city, Dominicans became a sizable presence in the New York heartland. Among them, Garcia credits the performance artist Josefina Baez as a key figure who brought Dominican artists together through festivals, theater performances, and exhibitions. In this creative milieu, Garcia met a number of prominent artists, including Germán Pérez and Federico Rodriguez. Some of them would become her lifelong friends and mentors. However, it was Baez's pioneering efforts to articulate the sentiments of a Blackless nation and politically reclaiming the derogatory term Dominican New York that were particularly important to island-born artists like Garcia, who felt alienated from their homeland. By the time Garcia met the co-founders of DYPG, New York-based Dominican-American artists had made several efforts to work and exhibit collectively, but none of these projects focused on the medium of printing. In Daydreaming, Soñando Despierta, Garcia transformed the island of Manhattan into a tropical playground. She intervened in the landscape by superimposing colorful external forms on a panoramic rendering of the city grid. A blue and white banana tree rises out of Central Park. Two red silhouettes of fruit-shaped airplanes hover over the island, and paper boats imprinted with the facade of a high-rise arrive on its shores. At the bottom of the image, Garcia included the profile of a dark-skinned figure. Difficult to discern at first glance, the viewer is likely to read this figure as a landmass, only later to discover facial features in his unknown territory. Garcia reorients the viewer to a coordinate plane that contrasts the bird's-eye view of the gridded metropolis with the racialized Dominican body. The figure is dark yet translucent, as if the brownish-red ink has been imprinted haphazardly across the bottom of the sheet. In an earnest statement, Garcia noted, quote, "The great brown figure powerfully evokes the heaviness of a dream overwhelmed by memory. It is a disturbed dream tangled in the ruthless clarity and linear rectitude of the map." End quote. According to the art historian Abigail Nardashti, the artist's black angels, a hallmark of her work, are part of a strategy to develop her critique of colonialism and its legacy, including Trujillo's Anglo-Hispanic identity discourse. The dictatorship of Rafael Leónidas Trujillo, who was active between 1930 until his assassination in 1961, invested in an educational system that promoted Dominicans' Spanish and indigenous roots and dismissed their African heritage in order to distinguish them from Haitians. It was not simply an ideological position. Trujillo's anti-Haitianism enabled extreme forms of state-sanctioned violence, most notably the massacre of more than 15,000 ethnic Haitians in October 1937, known as the Parsley Massacre. In her art, Garcia counters this racist ideology of negrophobia with mulatto icons symbolic of a Black and Spanish nation, a more accurate, if still contested view of the DR. Garcia's mulatto figures are often submerged in water, recalling the Middle Passage and migration to the U.S. Water has been a constant throughout her oeuvre. As the art historian Olga Rivera points out, Garcia conceives of the Atlantic as a, quote, gigantic transcontinental liquid highway of marine routes, mobility, and carrier of ancestral DNA. The sentiment is echoed by artists across the pond, like the Canadian-born British artist John Comfort, who noted, "It's impossible to overstate the significance of the sea in the formation of the African diaspora and Black identity." Garcia's submerged mulatto figures center the Black Atlantic in the discourse of the Migraña. This poses a direct challenge to much of the island's official discourses of identity, which privilege Spanish and Taino history, as is the case with many Latin American countries that promote mestizaje. Her oeuvre consistently reminds viewers of what is an undeniable Black heritage, stemming from the DR's ground zero position, as it was the first territory where slaves were brought from Africa into the New World, but also the longer history of free Blacks who have shaped Dominican culture. Centering the Black Atlantic is an important strategy shared by other Latinx artists of African descent, like the Afro-Panamanian artist Arturo Lindsay. Born in Pueblo, Panama, another historical slave port city, and reared in Brooklyn, New York, Lindsay developed a series titled Children of Middle Passage, which memorialized the many youngsters lost at sea when faced with the brutal conditions of slave ships. For his 2001 residency at the Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia, the Spelman professor produced 10 monochromatic portrait prints of these children. Lindsay limited his palette to a monochromatic black, the color that early modern Europe associated with darkness, death, and the devil, but which he attributes with a sense of beauty. Oni of Lagos from the series shows a spectral black silhouetted body emerging from a ship. Lindsay labored over the subject's delicate facial features, which he made angelic through a pointillist halo and the architectural illusion of an altar. Instruments of confinement, such as life shackles, appear as sources of their suffering. To undo the epistemic violence and anonymity that rendered these youth casualties of history, Lindsay titled each portrait with a traditional African name and a corresponding village. Gale of Ile-Ife, for example, hails from the holy city that the Yoruba considered the birthplace of humankind. The artist infused an Aphrodisiac worldview to the print series by adding symbols of Santeria. With this altar-like offering, Lindsay hopes their lives can be acknowledged and their spirits laid to rest. In these works, Lindsay challenges the disavowal of blackness that continues to plague Latinx. In one of his most cited articles, the literary critic Silvia Flores reflects on the complexity of racial paradigms in the Dominican Republic. He asks, how a society that represents the cradle of blackness in the Americas came to be in such denial of its overwhelming black and mulatto population? For Flores-Sayan, the answer is, of course, history, particularly how Dominicans navigated the contested sovereignty of their state with Haiti, the U.S., and Europe. The first event that precipitated the deracialization of Dominicans was the decline of the plantation economy and the subsequent impoverishment of the colony of Santo Domingo. This economic shift made the hierarchies of race and class, slave and master, obsolete, leading to a majority-free black population and the flourishing of interracial marriages. By the 17th century, mulattas and mulattoes were the ethnic majority in the DR. As a new republic in 1844, seeking official recognition from the U.S. and Europe, the ruling classes sought to distinguish themselves from black Haitians, a negrophobic position that Flores-Sayan argues drew significantly from North American sources. But he also noted the presence of Afro-Dominicans who fought bravely against the Spanish in the War of Restoration, when Spain tried to recolonize the fledgling republic. Their most pressing concern was the return of the institution of slavery, which had been abolished as a result of Haiti's efforts to decolonize Hispaniola. The Dominican concept of race, which had practically been decolorized by the end of the 19th century, found correspondence in Latin American theories of mestizaje built in opposition to U.S. imperialism. Although they favored mixed race, they nonetheless privileged whiteness. But it was Trujillo's regime that succeeded in manipulating this open concept of race. Flores-Sayan explains how his regime gave currency to the term Indio, to describe the complexion of people of mixed ancestry, by imposing it through official government documents and willfully eroding the connections to African heritage. The DYPG artist Miguel Luciano's Detrás de Oreja makes visible this incongruity. How could a country with 90% Afro-descendants still identify through Trujillo's Indio fictions? Luciano's print features a Dominican passport open to the photo page, where the artist's face is composed of 3 distinct skin tones. The rubber stamp that appears on the following page triangulates the racial terminology of Indio Claro and Indio Oscuro that persists in these government documents, including current-day licenses, creating a racialized gradation of an essentially fabricated category. The sociologist Jeanette Candelario notes that since the 19th century, the phrase "black behind the ears" has been part of Dominican vernacular, at once distinguishing the national body from Haitians and reluctantly admitting the predominance of African ancestry among the DR citizenry. The Detrás de Oreja's embellished tropical passport is another example of the Dominican body resisting an oppressive system of classification. Unable to register the subject's complexion, Luciano thwarts the system's desire for a racial order that divides blackness. The experience of leaving his homeland for war perhaps afforded the artist sufficient physical and psychological distance to question how those vexed terms followed individuals into a new geography. But another transformation occurs in the consciousness of Dominican migrants that reverses the legacy of the Burkinabe. According to Garcia Peña, the dual exile occurs for Dominicans forced to leave their island nation, only to encounter another form of exile as they become racialized into a U.S. minority. While many Dominican immigrants grew up believing in their racially Indian and culturally Hispanic origins, the racial system of this new geography identifies them as Black. Tatiana adds, quote, "It soon becomes obvious to Dominican immigrants that the larger U.S. society does not care to distinguish them between them and Haitians," end quote, given the one-drop rule that renders them both non-white. The 1.5 generation and second generation will most likely self-identify as Black, reversing Trujillo's malevolent negation. This development of a Black or Afro-Latinx consciousness in diaspora leads many artists and return migrants to question the antiquated and racist systems of classification in the DR based on negrophobia and white supremacy. Another water-based female archetype that emerges in this portfolio is the Ciguapa. Julia Alvarez begins her short story, The Secret Footprints, with the following description. On an island not too far away, and in a time not so long ago, lived a secret tribe called the Ciguapas. They made their homes underwater in cool blue caves hung with seashells and seaweed. They came out on land to hunt for food only at night because they were so fearful of humans. Described as mesmerizing, beautiful creatures with backward pointing feet and long hair, Ciguapas are the product of 19th century nationalist and indigenous literature. The scholar Genetic Abeladio explains that writers like Francisco Javier Angulo, who published La Ciguapa in 1866, used the figure to contend with the nation's contradictions of being both colonizer and colonized, enslaver and enslaved, immigrant and native born. Gale conjures the Ciguapa central image in a print titled My Girl on the Floor, using digital collages of flyers that advertise erotic dancers and access to the voluptuous room as a ninja print in the background. Udena overlaid is so operative that made the colorful flyers recede to the point of unreadability. At center, he placed a partial human figure supine. The curvature of the line work suggests that both of the figure's knees are bent and the backward feet hang menacingly over their genitalia. The vivacious surface of the print with splotches of black, gray, and white ink and visible brushwork lends the appearance of an underwater scene. Lena described his reference to the mythical figure as a metaphor for those immigrants who come seeking the American dream, but are easily misled and lose their way. In such a view, Elena Ciguapa is an archetype of the femme fatale, or enchantress, who will ultimately bring the fall of the prey. However, as a multivalent archetypal figure, the Ciguapa also embodies freedom. The Ciguapa paintings of Dominican-American artist Fidel Baez offer an important counterpoint to Elena's vision. Baez began the series studying the scientific illustrations by Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist known as the father of modern taxonomy. Linnaeus and his students also developed a system of human taxonomy in which non-white people, Americanos, Asiáticos, and Africanos, were closer to bestiality and ruled by impulse. His ideas gave birth to the scientific racism of the 18th century. Baez, who was born in Santiago de los Caballeros, a city bordering Haiti in the Dominican Republic, in 1901. Informed by having a Dominican mother and father of Haitian descent, she leans into these notions of the monstrous, challenging viewers in their assumptions of the Black female body. Her Ciguapas disrupt the vision of control and conquest from European prince of New World territories. They are powerful actors who embody rebellion and can evade capture like the runaway slave. In this agentic potential, Abeladio reads the formulation of a new symbology, the verb ciguapiar, a way for the underdog, the vulnerable, the marginal to reject and undermine the machinations of race thinking in the Dominican and U.S. nationalism. There are many other prints in Manifestaciones portfolio that I won't be able to address due to our time constraints today, but I would love for you to read about them in the book. For example, the print in Gale by Gale Coronado led into the history of U.S. interventions on the island. This kind of gunboat diplomacy was not something that I was aware of when I began this project. In the work of Juan de Lozano, I was able to trace the influence of African-American printmakers like Robert Blackburn, who was a beacon for welcoming immigrant artists to the New York workshop. Writing about Lozano's Estado de Santo was deeply moving for me as I listened to the artist talk about the single survivor of a shipwreck in the North Channel. Many Dominicans have no other recourse but to board small vessels, known as yolas, in the dead of night, with the hope of making it to Puerto Rico, where they might have the chance to buy documents and make their way to the neighboring U.S. These are difficult histories that help us understand why Dominicans became such a sizable presence, one of the fastest growing ethnic groups in New York City. Returning to the topic of submerged knowledges and forging connections to the Black Atlantic, my work with Dominican artists really opened my eyes to the way discourses of ethnography, mestizaje, and even indigeneity had disavowed Blackness not only in the case of the Dominican Republic, but in the larger sphere of Latin America and its U.S. diasporas. When Black Lives Matter protests erupted in the summer of 2020, many of us were perplexed at seeing signs like the one I'm showing you here. The Black Honduran American writer Janelle Martinez noted her disappointment in a Washington Post article stating how these problematic forms of solidarity erased Blackness, but that she wasn't shocked at all. This was on brand for the Latinx community. When 1 in 4 U.S. Latinas identifies as Black, these signs of solidarity don't just come across as empty gestures. They are in fact a way of disavowing the presence of Afro-Latinos. The prejudice, colorism, and erasure that Afro-Latinx people experience is a triple marginalization from the dominant culture, their own Latinx ethnic group, and at times from their fellow Black brothers and sisters in the African-American community. We know the slave trade brought millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas, and of those who survived the Middle Passage, the great majority lived, worked, and regained their freedom in Latin American and Caribbean nations. But the national policies of these Spanish-speaking countries encouraged racial mixing to whiten the national makeup and produced internal racism and internal colonialism. I started to ask myself, how can we be in such denial of our African ancestry? How can we engage in these forms of anti-Blackness which replicate a colonial mentality that subscribes to the racial hierarchies imposed by the Spanish and American empires? I'm not saying that all Latinx people should identify as Black, nor that all of them would know firsthand what it is like to live in a world intent on oppressing and demeaning Black life. But it is high time that we as Latinx people acknowledge the undeniable presence of African heritage, la herencia, that pervades every aspect of Latinx cultures, from fine-hearted music to foodways to syncretic belief systems to the botanicas and bodegas that line our city streets. The exhibition, All My Ancestors, the Spiritual and Afro-Latinx Art, came about through an invitation from Alan Edmonds, director of the Brainborn Workshop in Philadelphia. I had met Edmonds while conducting dissertation research in Philly almost 10 years prior, and he wanted me to spend some time thinking about how works in the Brandywine's Visiting Artists program were connected to the archives of Latinx printmaking workshops. Edmonds was particularly fond of self-help graphics because he had been a student at Tyler School of Art and had studied printmaking in Rome with Sister Karen Valero, the Franciscan nun who co-founded self-help graphics. But to be completely honest, I found almost no prints in their vast archive that dealt with Afro-Latinx heritage. But I knew that the work of the New York artists and the work of the Afro-Canadian Arturo Lindsay would be at the center of this exhibition project. All My Ancestors opened in February of 2022 and sought to highlight the ways Latinx artists invoke the spiritual to address their African ancestry in the Americas. I use the term spiritual in the broadest sense to address the use of religious beliefs, sacred iconography, the recognition of a collective connection to the cosmic or divine, and is knowledge passed down through generations to deal with the psychic and psychological toll of hardship. The artists in all my ancestors invoke the spiritual as an overarching framework that allows for the veneration of the black and brown body, the mourning for those souls lost in the middle passage, the syncretism of Afro-diasporic religious practices, the connection to land, and as a method to resist colonialism and capitalism's disregard for black life. While much is known about the influential role of Afro-Latinx artists in the realm of music, performance, and literature, this exhibition focused on their contributions to the medium of printmaking. Democratic art form par excellence, printmaking with its basis on collaboration, reproduction, and distribution has been an important platform to think through some of these ideas of what it means to be Black in the Latinx community, how one navigates forms of belonging or unbelonging, and how to reckon with the weight of the history of slavery. This exhibition drew from the print archives of the Brandywine, the Austin-based Coronado Studio and its residency program City Project, Pepe Coronado's Studio New York, the Dominican Mercury in Africa, Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, and the Experiencia de Africa in Havana, Cuba. These workshops and their residency programs have prioritized giving voice and helping shape an Afro-Latinx diasporic consciousness, though much of it has gone unrecognized. And this was the first time that a curator brought together this corpus of prints, creating a relational matrix between these sites of production. Scholar Martha Wendell Vega, among the first to document the spiritual dimension of Afro-Latinx art, argued that the presence of Ashe, the sacred life force, is what established a common aesthetic for these artists. A West African philosophical concept of the Yoruba Ifa tradition, the divine energy of Ashe brings power to the human, animal, natural, and spirit world. Although these beliefs traveled from Africa to the Americas and later from Latin America to the U.S. in the formation of an Afro-Latinx diaspora, certain icons, dances, oral histories, and music held true to this belief that all things animate and inanimate are endowed with spirit. Thus, ancestral memory and ancestral worship took on special significance in the conceptualization of Ashe. According to Wendell Vega, ancestors act as intermediaries between the divine and the human, appeal to the gods and goddesses that survive the middle passage, restore balance, and bring about good fortune. In these veiled forms of ancestral worship, disguised under syncretic rituals that correspond with the Catholic Church for fear of persecution, African descendants resisted cultural assimilation. The influence of Afro-diasporic religion, particularly the Yoruba belief in the Orisha, when a divine power converges with a natural force, deified ancestor or object, are especially evident in the work of Cuban artists in the exhibition. Epi Sayoni and Juan Bolsa made extraordinary prints that explore the all-male secret society of the Iroquois. The Nigerian Brotherhood of the Iroquois arrived to the port cities of Cuba through the slave trade and brought with it the establishment of fraternal societies that helped men in bondage maintain a sense of community, faith, and self-expression, and is now recognized as a religion in the African nation. Ayoni began to research the history and mythology of the Iroquois while she was still in high school, and the rich iconography of its narratives became her preferred subject matter in printmaking. Her residency at the Brandywine Workshop in 1999, the same year of her untimely death, resulted in offset lithographs like Untitled II, where she recurs the founding myth of the Iroquois when Princess Sigan unknowingly attracted fish while drawing water from the river, and the sacred creature revealed its supernatural power and sound. Legend has it that after Sigan disclosed the secret to a prince from a neighboring tribe, she was sentenced to death and condemned all women to be excluded from the Iroquois society. Not born of religious devotion nor hostility, Ayoni reimagined the beliefs of the Iroquois from the perspective of Sigan and the excluded women who appear without mouths in these prints and speak only through their emotive eyes and gestures. Her mastery of visual textures and monochromatic gradations can be seen in the leopard and scale-like skin of her subjects, as well as the detailed flora, fauna, and natural elements that make up the sacred iconography of this group. Bolsa, on the other hand, examined the Iroquois religious practice from the standpoint of an artist priest. He studied at the San Alejandro Academy in Havana with Carlos Enrique and Miguel. While much of his early work explored science fiction, his eventual exile through the Maria boat lift, perhaps as a result of his sexuality, led him to New York, where he turned to a deep and rigorous exploration of Afro-Cuban spirituality. In the Congograph of Series 6, which he made at the Blackburn Current Workshop, Bolsa referenced the form of an elegant vessel known as a caldero or sopera de santo. During colonial times, slaves used calderos and soperas in Cuba to hide symbols of the orishas, which had been outlawed by their masters. Bolsa symbolically referenced this history with the spirit that dwells inside this vessel, whose yellow eyes peer directly at the viewer. The symmetry of its composition and vibrant color palette, pinks, reds, yellows, multicolored rough textures, invokes curiosity and adoration. Moreno Vega also documented how the Orisha tradition in New York City led to musical breakthroughs and helped introduce the rhythms of Santeria, Iroquois, and Congo music to the world. In fact, the renowned Palladium nightclub in Harlem hosted some of the first public performances of Orisha music in the 1950s. She notes how Cuban musicians experienced in La drumming were often initiated and venerated the Orisha Amina, the owner of sacred drums. These recent transplants to New York City brought this knowledge of music and infused it into new forms of Afro-American jazz, leading to innovative genres like Cuba, and more importantly, bringing together African-American and Latinx musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Hugo Blanque through the polyrhythms of African philosophy. Music and its ability to move our bodies and spirits is a topic taken up by several artists in the exhibition. Jamaican-born artist Keith Morrison extends this interest to the African roots of the Argentine tango, which, as many of you know, originated in the black barrios of Buenos Aires. Music pulsates through these wildly colorful prints, which appear to capture dancers and mythical creatures, in this case a national cockfight, in motion. Moreover, Dominican New York artist Moses Ross Suarez's etching, Machadero, shows a dancing figure that bridges the divides between his beloved island and the Muslim city through the sound of bachata and reggaeton. Ross Suarez, who trained as an architect and works in sculpture, painting, and printmaking, infuses much of his work with a sense of joy and movement that invokes the African origins of Caribbean music. Opera is perhaps the most spectacular of its forms, combining music, song, and dramatic acting. In the spring of 2021, the Bronx-born Afro-Dominican artist Elaine Rodriguez returned to the Dominican Republic to film Gale, an opera film that involved a collaboration with Cuban composer Luis Felipe and librettist Rafael Almanza. Commissioned by the American Society, Gale recounts an African legend where Queen Abedidi refuses to sacrifice her beautiful bird and is condemned to death for her disobedience, a story that shares interesting parallels to the figure of Sican in the work of Becky Sayon. And I'm going to play just a very short clip. This was done during COVID-19 pandemic and was actually debuted online, and it was created as an online work of art. So I'm just going to show you the first few seconds.
Y aquí la fábula de la ofrenda que no hizo la reina, versión de una leyenda rifada. En el palacio del monte vivía una reina repentina. Poseía un pájaro fulgurante ideal. Su plumaje era como joyas de fuego y su voz convocaba a los hombres de todas las lejanías.
I hope you get a chance to look for it on YouTube. It's about 38 minutes. And then you're going to find out what happens with Queen Divinity. But as you saw, there's these very beautiful, dazzling costumes that Elaine Rodriguez produces for her projects. And these are seen in all of her camera work. This was shown at the recent Biennale that some of you may have seen it in New York. In Italy, she collaborated with choreographers and to film these dancers on site in the ruins of colonial buildings, specifically those which had been sites of enslaved labor, such as the Boca de Nigua sugar mill. And after they screen the film, there's a beautiful conversation that happens between Rodriguez and Luis Aguirre, who's the composer, and I found it so fascinating that he called the visual and dramatic spectacle an exorcism of the island. Rodriguez then went on to create a bowl in Greece in 2021. It's drawn from the film still and documents her recent collaboration with Dominican master printer Pedro Bernardo in Austin, Texas. Another section of the exhibition highlighted the connections between nature and spirituality. The Martinican writers Amy Césaire and Suzanne Césaire wrote at length about how Black Caribbeans are politically and spiritually connected to the land, and their work as part of the negritude movement influenced many artists who began to envision the tropical landscape as critical to a Black modernity and as a site of self-determination for African descendants in the Americas. The Afro-Honduran artist Sine Ibarra looks at the matriarchal figures who carry on the traditional and spiritual beliefs of her Garifuna heritage. In the late 18th century, British colonists forcibly exiled the Garifuna, a community of mixed-race African and Carib Indians who were resisting enslavement and assimilation on the island of St. Vincent. Despite their traumatic displacement to the Bay Islands of Honduras, Garifuna culture flourished along Central America's Caribbean coastline, and in 2001, UNESCO declared their language, dance, and music as intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Guevara began her artistic training at the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes in Tegucigalpa, where she recalls being the only person of African descent among 200 students, an experience that left her determined to make visible the beauty and resilience of Garifuna people. The exhibition included 3 of her linocut prints, a technique she developed studying under Ghanaian printmaker Esther Beretis. Each print centers the Garifuna women and how they carry out traditional food ways with staples such as fish, plantain, and ground coconut. Guevara's prints are likewise attentive to the natural environment of the Atlantic coast and how Garifuna artisanal practices sustain life, guided by their stewardship and reclamation of the land. Her work demonstrates that Garifuna women have for centuries enacted Césaire's desire for a rootedness that would lead to empowerment. The spiritual connection to nature is also evident in the work of Dominican artist Julio Reyes. The artist relocated to the United States in 1993 when he received a fellowship to work at the Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. During this time, he adopted the silhouette as a way to reflect on his shifting identity as a recent transplant. His interest in the silhouette is reminiscent of the work of the late Cuban artist Ana Dieta, who used her body as an imprint on the earth, drawing connections between nature and the feminine divine. A residency invitation to the Brandywine Workshop resulted in Valdez's Building Myself in 1996, a painterly offset lithograph where his body emerges out of plant-like and water forms. The human form consists of a series of vertical blue and green strokes with a bangle petroglyph at the center and a crescent moon which marks the subject's head. The artist outlined the silhouette in a bright white, suggesting the figure emerges from a reflective surface, which contains not only water, but also tropical leaves that frame the body. The act of surrendering to nature or seeing oneself as inseparable from the Antillian terrain recalls Suzanne Césaire's notion of the plant man, that in her words, Like the plant, he abandons himself to the rhythm of universal life. He makes no effort to dominate nature. I'm not saying that he makes the plants grow, I'm saying that he grows, that he lives like a plant. End quote. The rootedness in the terrain of the Caribbean islands and waters that Césaire advocated was meant to empower Afro-diasporic subjects to counter the disenfranchised positions brought up by slavery and colonialism, and restore a balance to the tropics through stewardship, reclamation, and opposition to extractive economies. Building myself is part of this tradition that Macarena Gomez calls submerged perspectives, the decolonial viewpoint that rejects seeing land from above as something to be conquered and controlled, and instead seeing one's place in the world from an embodied perspective. For Dominican American artists, bodies of water are conduits to this decolonial viewpoint. They have been critical to dismantling internalized racism, colorism, and anti-Haitianism, even within their own families. This is a particularly important project that is being forged in diaspora in order to challenge the racial discrimination that remains pernicious and codified into law in the DR. Just last November, the U.S. Embassy issued an advisory that U.S. citizens of African descent should exercise extreme caution traveling in the country. The Dominican police were profiling and detaining dark-skinned travelers, assuming they were Haitian. Out of the country's 11 million residents, only 8% identify as Black in some capacity, according to a study conducted by the United Nations. Since the time of Trujillo, Dominicans have positioned themselves as a white or Indio nation in opposition to a Black Haiti, and since the early 2000s, laws have been enacted to see Haitian migrants as non-residents. 2023 marks the 10-year anniversary of La Sentencia, a law that retroactively, till 1929, eliminated birthright citizenship to those born to foreign parents, and to create a specialized police force to enforce migration law. These measures have likewise created rampant discrimination for Black Dominicans and for Dominicans of Haitian descent. Activists are fighting back through lobbying, advocacy, and education, as in the work of Movimiento de Mujeres Dominico-Haitianas and Reconocido. These activists agree that cultivating a Black political consciousness in the DR is absolutely necessary to transforming the politics of the Dominican Republic towards Haiti, but also towards its Black citizens, and perhaps finally put an end to Trujillo's Indio fictions. The work of Dominican North artists clearly responds to these racial exclusions and the way they experience embodiment in the U.S. Black and white racial imaginary, but also locally responds to these injustices in their ancestral island homeland. Thank you so much.
So we have time for 2 or 3 questions. We'll go over. Let me give you the microphone so we can hear you. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll add this to you. Any questions or comments? Don't be shy. It's all about love here. No judgments.
Thank you for the talk, very informative. I had the privilege of being a student of Shed 7. Yeah, I guess if you want to.
At Parsons?
At UT.
Oh,
If you could talk about your experience with her, it seemed like you know her personally.
yeah. Thank you for your question. So I got to know Sherazade Garcia pretty well over the years. My first connection to this group was through Beto Coronado because he was connected to Coronado's studio in Austin, Texas, and that's where I was based doing my graduate work. But when I got a chance to meet Sherazade, she is such a warm and amazing, inviting person. And I was able to do some studio visits with her at some point. I also asked if she could come to Dartmouth where I was working, And she gave the most amazing artist talk. So I'm trying to navigate there. There it is. She's like a painter's painter. She's an incredible artist. And she was based in New York for many years, and then landed this really wonderful opportunity to move to UT Austin, and is now a professor of painting there, which is so exciting for a lot of students. I'd say that out of this collective of 12, Garcia was probably the most well known. And I think that it's really wonderful that she decided to become a co-founder and to work with this group, because I think it brought a lot of attention to some of the artists who maybe weren't as well known as she was. And it's not easy to work with a collective. They decided when they began the project that they were going to make an edition of 25 of these. They were going to be either 7 by 9 or 9 by 7. These are really small prints, right? And so they had to kind of find a way to continue their own individual research, but also work within these kind of guidelines that they had set for themselves for the money business and this portfolio. And I think it turned out to be a really beautiful portfolio. It's part of many museums now. Smithsonian American Art was one of the first to purchase it, thanks to Karen Ramos. It would then go to the Hood Museum, and it's part of many others now. But that was my experience with her. She's absolutely wonderful, and all of you had a chance to follow her on social media.
I'm afraid we're out of time. They gave me a time limit. It's only one more, but 2 minutes. Yeah, that's it.
Hi, Tatiana. I'm so happy you're here. And I think it's not wrong to say that you're now one of the experts of Latinx art. So I wanted to know if you could maybe talk a little bit about your journey and focus on the print medium, something that normally in Latinx art has been seen as emblematic of social movements, very specific subject matter, but here you're talking about borders beyond the U.S.-Mexico border, so decentering this border that we associate with Latinidad, but also talking about anti-Blackness within the Latinx community, which is also something that is not always done enough. So why specifically are you so interested in the print medium, and a little bit about your journey, since this is the focus of your book too?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy. So this journey began a very long time ago for me. As an undergrad, I worked with members of the Royal Chicano Air Force in Sacramento. That's where I did my undergrad work, and I have a PhD in art studio. And I learned to silkscreen with this group, and I learned about all of the activism that went into creating posters for the United Farm Worker Movement, which was their focus. Cesar Chavez would call them every time he was going to bring in a march into Sacramento and say, I need 1,000 posters for tomorrow. And they would stay up all night and silkscreen mega flags. And they would also work security for Cesar Chavez because he was constantly under death threats. And then when I had a chance to start traveling around the country, I realized that what had happened in Sacramento with that group had actually happened in many other cities in the country, and that printmaking had brought these groups together, and often it was related to a particular social movement. I think I feel that a lot of what we do as art historians when we write these articles and do these books is that we're actually curating, right? We're choosing very specific objects to tell a story. And the reason I chose this collective is because I found that it was connected to these other sites that I was interested in. Coronado Studio in Austin, Texas is where Pepe became a master printer, and then eventually moved to New York and wanted to start something for Dominicans there. But it's because he had spent time at Coronado in Austin, and he had been sent to Suffolk Graphics to see how his process worked for Chicano artists, and he knew that this could be done for Dominican Americans as well, and that it could have really powerful effect if they worked collaboratively. And so I feel that that's what led me there, and a lot of my work is really about this kind of work, following a trail of organic leads, right, that just sort of happen sometimes. Sometimes it's autobiographic, but other times it's you're just following different roads. And through their work, I did become aware of these issues about race and class and anti-blackness and things that I was myself not aware of, right, of how racial formation happens in DR, and the kinds of issues that these artists face in the US as well. So I really wanted to include in the book. I think it helps to center US-Mexico as the only border that we think about, when really border environment is something that all immigrants are dealing with, right? You can have an affiliation Jamaican as well. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Tatiana.